Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the presentation of my research project on the contribution of research and innovation policy to the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Maxime Schoch. Over the past 6 months, I have been working at Swisscorp as a trainee, and I've pursued this research project, which I will present to you today. This will be the content of the presentation. So first of all, I would like to introduce you to the overall Sdg framework and present to you the action that has been taken already on a political level by the EU. After that, I will pursue to my main theme, which is going to be the Sdg coverage under the new framework program for research and innovation, Horizon Europe. There we'll talk mostly on clusters and missions, and will then apply a framework to the coverage of the SDGs under the clusters and missions to draw a first conclusion of how well the SDGs are covered. After, I would like to talk some more about the reorganization of the Directorate General for Research and Innovation of the European Commission and how SDGs played a role in reshaping the DG. Finally, I will present to you some reactions of European R&I stakeholders and will then draw my final conclusions. So in 2015, the signatory countries of the UN have agreed on the Agenda 2030. This Agenda 2030 has 17 SDGs at its heart. Together with the Paris Agreement on Climate Change and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, the Agenda 2030 serves as a roadmap to a sustainable future. As I said, it contains 17 goals and 169 sub-targets. To be a little more specific, the goals are very broad in their nature. So for example, there is SDG 14, which concerns life underwater. So it's very broad. And then you have the sub-targets, so those 169, which are more specific. So for example, the sub-target 14.5 under this SDG life underwater is then by 2030, at least 10% of coastal and marine areas should be conserved. So this is way more concrete. The Agenda 2030 tries to address sustainable development in all of its three dimensions, which are an ecological dimension, an economic, and a societal dimension. It's very important that all of those three dimensions are addressed at the same time, and that not only one is pursued and the others are neglected. The whole Agenda 2030 and all the goals are interconnected, which means they have to be looked at in their totality and not just one by one. Because of that, it is important to have a holistic approach when trying to implement the SDGs and the Agenda 2030. An example would be of that, for example, you have SDG 8, which concerns decent jobs and economic growth. And so this would be more of an economic SDG. And it's really important that it's addressed at the same time with the other dimensions, for example, environmental protection, but also social inclusion to ensure for a truly sustainable future. So as I said, the Agenda 2030 got adopted in 2015. And now I'll turn to the action that the European Union has taken as of 2015. So when it comes to SDG implementation, it is the European Commission that is in the lead. The European Commission has mainly done two big actions, which concern of a communication, which was published in 2016, and a reflection paper, which was published in 2019. So in the communication from 2016, so the early one, this was published as a first reaction to the adoption of the Agenda 2030. So in there, the European Commission tried to highlight what actions they have already taken and how they would be connected with the SDGs. So to show that actually sustainability and sustainable development is very much already very much incorporated within EU policies. So that was in 2016, this first reaction. And then the second reaction was published in 2019, and this is the reflection paper. This reflection paper really served as an implementation strategy of the European Commission. And in it, there are 4 key areas of planned policy action. So what's going to happen in the future? In order to come up with this reflection paper in 2019, the Commission has launched a high-level multi-stakeholder platform already in 2017. The goal of this platform was to include stakeholders from all different sectors and all the different government levels in Europe to try to elaborate a overarching EU strategy to implement the SDGs. So really to take everyone on board already at an early age, and therefore that all stakeholders would be represented within this final reflection paper, so this implementation strategy. In there were also the consulting agencies of the EU were consulted, so there's Economic and Social Committee and the Committee of the Regions. So also those levels have been consulted. Over the course of this process, so from 2015 to 2019, the Council of the European Union has published several conclusions in regard to SDGs. You see it here on the slide, one in 2017, another one in 2018. In those, they urged the Commission to be faster to come up with an implementation strategy, but at the same time, the Council positions itself behind the European Commission and really urges the Commission to take the lead on SDG implementation. The last Council conclusion, however, was published in April 2019, so shortly after the reflection paper, and in there, the Council actually expresses doubts that the reflection paper is a concrete implementation strategy. So they do not regard it to be an implementation strategy because the reflection paper is lacking timelines and specific objections. So what they did is they re-urged the Commission to come up with a more concrete implementation strategy in the future. So as I already said, we have this 2 workstream action of the European Commission, the communication, which also concerns external policy dimension, which means mostly development cooperation with the Global South. And then there's the reflection paper that really tries to take into account the intra-EU policy action. Also in this scenario, reflection paper, there are 3 possible scenarios outlined for the future. So how the EU should position itself, and it's clear that the Commission prefers the first of those proposed scenarios, which is an overarching EU SDG implementation strategy, which would then position the European Union as a global frontrunner in sustainable development. Also, the European Parliament, and as I said before, the Council, they strongly stand behind the European Commission in regard to that scenario and that ambition. So in this reflection paper, as I already said, there are 4 key enablers mentioned for sustainable development. And those are also the areas that the EU has to strengthen in the future in order to guarantee this sustainable transition. Here you see on the right-hand side those 4 enablers. And you also see that research and innovation is part of the first one. So it is written in the reflection paper that research and innovation have an important role as a catalyst for change. Investing in innovation and technological development today will in the longer run help us to lower the costs of meeting our long-term policy goals, such as those related to our climate and our environmental targets. So research innovation is mentioned as an important key enabler in the paper. And as we all know, the instrument of the European Union to strengthening research innovation are the European framework programs. And at the moment, the 9th generation framework program, Horizon Europe, is in its preparatory stage and is ready to be implemented soon. So we see here on the timeline, actually Horizon Europe is one of those key enablers that will contribute to achieving this Agenda 2030. So I will now come to my main part, how can research innovation actually contribute? And how are they covered under Horizon Europe? So as you all know, Horizon Europe has taken over the 3-pillar structure from its predecessor program, Horizon 2020. Similar to Horizon 2020, Horizon Europe has an entire pillar dedicated to address global challenges. Using a top-down approach, Pillar 2 of Horizon Europe defines research areas where collaborative research is expected to have an impact on these global challenges. You see in this graphic here in red, it's Pillar 2 highlighted. So the biggest part of the budget is allocated in Pillar 2. Although at this moment we are not sure how much this budget will be, because this will depend on the negotiations of the multi-annual financial framework of the EU that will happen this fall. But it's clear that it will be the largest part of the budget. So in the proposal of the Commission, it was 52% of the overall budget that would go into Pillar 2. So into collaborative research that is steered towards solving global challenges. In this Pillar 2, we find 6 thematic clusters. And again, those try to define research area where collaborative research projects which collaborative research projects should address. The legal text of Horizon Europe defines that these clusters should have a strong SDG focus. And also within the annex of the decision implementing Horizon Europe, the concrete SDGs that are going to be addressed under each specific clusters are named. This is displayed here on this next slide. I will not go over all of the clusters, but you see here the 6 clusters. And this graphic is taken directly from the annex of the decision implementing Horizon Europe. And it's listed how each cluster should address every SDGs, or better, which SDGs should be addressed by which cluster. And you see there are some clusters that are very specifically designated to few SDGs, such as the health cluster, which of course concerns the health SDG and also the climate action SDG. So same goes for the third cluster, the civil security and society, or the second or the 6th cluster, which groups many different SDGs and also from many different dimensions. So I won't go over all of them, but here in this next graphic, I listed those SDGs that were mentioned the most under the clusters. Just to say, all of the SDGs were mentioned at least once within the annex, except for the SDG 17, which concerns partnerships for the goals. And since Pillar 2 only talks about collaborative research, this cluster can be seen as a given. But all of the other 16 SDGs are addressed at least once. So here in this graph, I try to list those SDGs that were mentioned 4 or 3 times. And as you see, the ones that are mentioned most is SDG 9, which is industry, innovation, and infrastructure, and SDG 13, which concerns climate action. Maybe just to specify at this point, so the climate action SDG, or in general climate action, is mentioned a lot within the legal framework, which is due to the fact that the legislative text of Horizon Europe specifies already that at least 35% of the overall budget of the Horizon Europe program must be spent on research towards climate change. So this is an explanation, and we will see that later, that SDG 13 is always very much represented. So I'll come back to this table after. Now I would like to talk about another instrument within Horizon Europe. So we have the clusters, and the second instrument through which Horizon Europe addresses SDGs are the European Research and Innovation missions. Those missions are integrated within Pillar 2, so within the budget of Pillar 2, but they can also include actions from other parts of the Horizon Europe program, as well as from completely other EU funding programs. And we see here also in the legislative text, it says missions should use SDGs as a source for their design and implementation. Maybe just to explain a little what this mission-based approach is. So the idea behind it is to set a really ambitious but specific target. For example, the best example would be the Man on Moon mission. So the target would be to put a man on moon by a specific date. And then, so this is that the target is set, but not the instruments are defined by which this target should be achieved. So the idea behind this is that with this approach, and by defining this mission, you just let the different sectors and actors work towards them in a bottom-up approach. So they would decide themselves what action would be best to then at the end achieve that well, in a way, top-down mission, which was defined earlier. So in the legal text of Horizon Europe does not define concrete missions yet. Only thing that is specified within the legal text are mission areas. And then in a second step, the concrete missions within the mission areas will be defined. This will happen over the course of the next half year. So since the missions are not yet concrete, there is also no specific listing of which SDGs will be addressed under the missions. But what I did in my research project is that based on the titles of the mission areas, I tried to do a preliminary assessment of which SDGs could potentially be addressed by the concrete missions that will be defined later. So, and I did that in a way of a minimalistic approach. So of course, there could always be more SDGs addressed, but I really tried to list those SDGs that have to be addressed given the name. So for example, a mission area concerning cancer, it doesn't really matter how the specific mission will look like, but it for sure will address SDG 3, good health and well-being. Same with, for example, the mission area 1, adaptation to climate change, including societal transformation. It is clear that SDG 13, climate change, will be addressed, but at the same time, all the SDGs addressing societal transformations, of course, will also be addressed. So here in this graphic, you see an exhaustive list of which SDGs are addressed according to my preliminary assessment within those mission areas. As you see, they're all mentioned once, except for, again, climate action, which actually is addressed by 3 different missions. But as I said, this is because the legal text already specifies that the overall program has to address, well, has to spend at least 35% of the budget on climate change. I'll come back to this list later. So just to sum up, so we see that SDGs were mentioned in the legislative text on the missions. However, the European Commission did a call for mission board members. They are then responsible for coming up with the concrete missions. And in that call that was launched in spring this year, SDGs were not mentioned. But the European Commission can still steer the SDG coverage under the mission in first appointing suitable mission board members. This is a process that is right now happening in the European Commission. And in a second step, in then agreeing on the selected concrete missions by the mission board members. This final agreeing is going to happen together with the member states. Well, so in co-creation with the member states. So we saw that Horizon Europe actually has 2 main instruments to address SDGs, the clusters and the missions. So I would now like to introduce you to a framework with the help of which I would try to assess this SDG coverage. So this framework was developed by CSR Europe, which is a business network concerned with sustainability. And what they did, they questioned experts from different sectors and different government levels in Europe to assess progress scores for every SDG in Europe. And here on this first graph, the net progress on SDGs, on every SDGs in Europe is shown. As we see, they're all negative, which means no SDG has yet been achieved. And you see the further negative they are, so the further negative the score is, the further away from achieving the goal Europe is. And so we see Europe is really far from achieving, for example, both biodiversity goals, which are life below water and also life on land, but also the inequalities and peace, justice, and strong institutions, and also climate actions are really far from being achieved. On the other hand, there are some which are much closer to being achieved, for example, the partnerships, also the industry SDG. A second graph I would like to familiarize you with is this gap analysis of urgency required and its attention received. It's also done by CSR. And so what they did here is to, again, according to expert opinions, make a gap analysis of how much attention a SDG gets compared to the urgency that is required. So we see here with the SDGs that are on the left-hand side in the negative scores, those are SDGs that currently receive more attention than given the urgency they require. And on the other hand, the ones that have a positive score, those SDGs would require more attention given the high urgency they have. So again, we see here, for example, of course, it corresponds with the first graph, but in some it's also different. For example, climate action is so far in the positive because it's a very, very urgent matter. Although it already currently receives quite a lot of attention, it's still high up in the positive because it's really urgent. So what happens when we apply these two graphs to the clusters and emissions? I would first like to talk about the clusters. So we see that the SDGs that are most mentioned within the clusters, that is SDG 9, so the industry one, but also the health SDG, 8, decent work and economic growth, and 11, sustainable cities and communities. Those are SDGs, they're marked in red, that are actually on the positive axis of the graph I just showed you, which means they currently receive already more attention than the urgency they would require. Which means by addressing them, this gap is not closed. On the other hand, with climate action and also 12, responsible consumption and production, SDGs are addressed that actually do deserve more attention than they already have right now. But we see overall, the clusters seem to address more SDGs that are not as urgent as others. And especially the ones that have the lowest net progress score. So for example, the biodiversity ones and also inequality and the strong institutions, those are not amongst the SDGs that are mentioned the most within Horizon Europe. If we turn to the missions, we see a different picture. Here we see those SDGs that actually have low net progress scores, such as the equalities, but also SDG 14, life below water, and the one on institutions, the strong institutions 116, they are addressed. Also, of course, we have climate action and clean water and sanitation and zero hunger. So with those SDGs and responsible consumption, of course, with those SDGs, the missions address SDGs that are actually in need of having more attention. So this is a very positive picture. I just want to stress here again that, of course, this assessment was done on the preliminary assessment. So we don't have the concrete missions already now, which means the picture can still change. But if the implementation is done in the way it was set up by the legal text, it would propose a really positive picture on which SDGs are addressed. So to conclude, what is our first conclusions? We saw that in the clusters, not the SDGs are addressed that have the lowest net progress scores, and also not the SDGs are addressed which have the biggest urgency attention gap. But we actually see a strong focus on an industry, which can also be explained by the fact that, of course, the whole pillar is called Global Challenges and Industrial Competitiveness. With emissions, the picture is different. Of course, the SDG coverage is to a certain degree unclear because there aren't any concrete missions yet. But as of right now, the missions seem to address urgent SDGs. Also, it's important to see that this mission-based approach which really wants to facilitate collaboration between different sectors and between different actors is very much in favor of the essence of the overall Agenda 2030 and the Sdg Framework, because it really demands this holistic approach where sectors have to collaborate together. So this would be given this background, the missions seem to be a very suitable instrument to address SDGs. But also it again shows the importance of the strategic planning process, which is happening right now, where stakeholders are questioned to give impact on what impact Horizon Europe shall achieve by 2030. And by that also, of course, the SDGs and the focus on SDGs can still be shifted. And it shows that it's really important to steer also the European Commission in the right direction to actually still have the SDGs as an important component when it comes to the concrete missions. In general, it's clear that Horizon Europe has the SDGs at its heart, and Horizon Europe has the potential to be an important tool for the SDG implementation for the whole European Union, especially for the Commission. Climate change is most addressed because it's also very urgent, and definitely more action would be required on the fields of biodiversity, which is also corresponds to the UN report that was launched this spring, which actually critiques the high speed that biodiversity loss is accelerating. Climate change is still very important, and also the reduced inequalities, an SDG where Europe is not doing too well, and also which is not yet addressed enough. So this was the part on the SDG coverage of Horizon Europe. I would now like to proceed to the next topic, which is the organization of the DG research and innovation within the European Commission. So the way the DG RTD used to be organized was very closely aligned with the societal challenges under Horizon 2020. So the directorates corresponded basically to the societal challenges, which contributed to the fact that the societal challenges were treated isolated from each other. Here is an example. So for example, we see that Directorate I concerns climate action and resource efficiency, which aligns pretty much with the societal challenge, climate action, resource efficiency, and raw materials. So as I said, this led to the fact that the societal challenges were treated really isolated from each other. But with a new organigram of DG RTD, which is in place since the 1st of June this year, the Commission tried a different approach, and they wanted to no longer have the directorates correspond to the clusters, which would correspond to societal challenges under 2020, but actually they wanted to have the directorate or the directorates within correspond directly to the SDGs. With that, they also wanted to have they wanted DG RTD to take a sort of a compass role for the whole European Commission. So what they did is they used this graphic here which is another way to visualize the SDGs, which is called the wedding cake model, and this tries to group SDGs. So the first layer of the wedding cake concerns those SDGs which are concerned with our planet and with the biosphere. So for example, clean water sanitation, the 2 SDGs on biodiversity, and of course climate action. The next layer concerns people. So it's society, and there we have all the societal SDGs grouped. For example, no hunger, zero poverty, but also the strong institutions. And then the next layer concerns the economic dimension. So it's called prosperity, and in there we have, for example, the industry cluster, but also the decent work and economic growth, the inequalities, and responsible consumption and production. And on top of all those lie the partnerships, because they are relevant for all the different layers. And the DG has taken this model and tried to reorganize themselves according to it. So according to those 4 Ps: planet, people, prosperity, and partnership. And what came out was this following new organigram. Maybe you cannot read everything from this slide, but it's available on the internet. So first of all, it's really important to see that just above the Director General, Jean-Éric Paquet, there is now a designated advisor for Sustainable Development Goals, which is Thomas Arnold. And so he is directly advising the whole DG and the steering board on SDGs. And then there are the 4 directorates there that are exactly shaped according to these 4 P wedding cake layers. So there is the directorate for Healthy Planet and Clean Planet. So we have the Planet Directorate. Then there's one for People and one for Prosperity. And within the directorates, it's important to see that not only one dimension is looked at. So if we take, for example, Unit C3, which concerns climate and planetary boundaries, while C2 concerns food systems and clearly includes societal and economic aspects. So we have within one directorate, there are really all dimensions represented. And this corresponds to this approach of and this ambition of DGRTD to really breaking down the silos. Also, we see here unit C5 and E6. Those are both so-called bridge building units. So C5 actually tries to link ecological and social transitions. So link healthy planet and clean planet together with social factors. And the same thing is done then between people and prosperity to actually have economic and social transitions. So to really link those layers also of this wedding cake. So to have really this breaking down silos approach where not only one dimension is taken into account in one directorate. So as I said, through breaking down the bureaucratic silos within the DGRTD actually wants to break down silos also on research projects and amongst researchers. So at the end, this also comes down that they really want to have more transdisciplinary research in the future, because this would be the most suiting way to address societal challenges or global challenges, so the SDGs, because all dimensions need to be addressed at the same time. Another new thing is this co-creation of work programs with the stakeholders, where our DGRTD really wants to have everyone on board to define work programs, but then also with that specific calls. So to really have everyone on board. And this is, of course, very much in spirit of the missions, namely with, so this is the last point, that with this new approach, DGRTD also wants to collaborate more with different DGs from the European Commission. This is also, of course, the overarching ambition of Horizon Europe to finally unite all the research efforts of the Commission and give it one big budget and make different actors work together and different sectors in order to really achieve the maximum of impact. And as I said, with that, DGRTD really wants to take on a leading function within the Commission. So my next point is actually concerning the reactions of the European research and innovation stakeholders, which are also important for shaping, of course, as I mentioned, this strategic plan. So before I come to the reactions, I just want to mention that DGRTD really wanted to include all the different stakeholders in the strategic planning process of Horizon Europe. So to really define the impact that Horizon Europe should achieve by not only the end of the program, but actually really 2030. So again, we see this this alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. So what's happening right now, in July 2019, there's an online consultation of the European Commission on the strategic plan as it is so far. And if you look at it, you see that this has a large SDG focus, and stakeholders are actually, they're encouraged to prioritize SDGs and to really set an emphasis on where research and innovation, on which SDG research and innovation could actually have an impact. So the problem is there is no prioritization. So in theory, if one would do this online consultation, could put very relevant on every SDG, so that research innovation is very relevant for every SDG. But of course, the goal behind this is to really see some priorities where R&I should focus on, and in order to be more strategic. Then there will be the R&I Days in September 2019, where the first results of this online consultation will be presented. And after, in October 2019, umbrella organizations will be consulted on their position. So now is really the time for stakeholders of research innovation in Europe to take action and shape this implementation, and with that, of course, also ensure an SDG focus. And during my research, I also tried to, I did have several interviews with European R&I stakeholders. And on this following slide, I would just, there's a summary of those 4 umbrella organizations I have interviewed, just to give you a short overview of what the positions of those organizations actually are. So in general, I think the overall impression was that César, UA, and Leroux, all those three have been, they do not really see too much opportunity within Horizon Europe. So what they did, and also because they, of course, this strategic planning process that is happening right now, it's the first time that this is happening, which means stakeholders are also a little overwhelmed just by this new process. And as I mentioned, those three organizations, what they did is they came up with their own strategies of how they could help achieving the SDGs. So for example, the EUA has defined in its own strategy paper 4 SDGs where university action has direct action on. Also mentioned that it's for them really difficult to have a unified position on the SDG coverage of on the Horizon Europe because there are so many universities. César, they are mostly focusing on key technologies such as AI, biotech, and quantum to address the SDGs in the future and to try to provide evidence for science-based policy decision. They're not in favor in general of this top-down science policy approach that is carried out under the Pillar 2 of Horizon Europe and do not regard the SDG coverage under Horizon Europe as sufficient. Leroux mostly has, when it comes to SDGs, a cooperation with the Global South in their strategy. So they really want to focus on capacity building and exchange of staff and focus also on education on SDGs with those massive online courses that have, and they have several on SDGs actually. They are not too much concerned with Horizon Europe and rely more on their own university networks when it comes to SDGs. And as I said, want to come on with their own SDG strategies. The Guild was actually the only umbrella organization I have talked with that have really openly positioned themselves on Horizon Europe and the SDGs. And they very much support the European Commission and also lobbied for a strong SDG focus on their Horizon Europe. And they also think that it's good that the impact of science is made visible to the public, which is, done by the missions, as I mentioned. The only thing that the Guild fears is that because the missions really aim at linking together different sectors and different sectors working together under this budget of Horizon Europe, it is the Guild is scared that in that way the research policy could be abused of just being more of a coordination, or the research DG could be abused as being more of a coordination DG between the different sectors and less as a DG that is purely focused on funding research. So they like missions and this approach, and they think it's suitable for SDG implementation, but they would rather see it happening through other channels of funding, for example, structural funds. Also, what they criticized is that there is no scientific advisor groups on the Horizon Europe and that they only have ad hoc groups there. So these are the main reactions of those European R&I stakeholders. So to conclude, and these are the final conclusions, again, there is a strong SDG focus in the legislative text of Horizon Europe. And with Horizon Europe, the Commission really follows a new approach, not only in science policy, but also in its organization. So this is really something completely new and really has the SDGs at its heart. Especially the missions are very useful for addressing SDGs because they really try to link up different sectors and actors, as I mentioned. But the problem could be that they focus too little on actual science policy, and of course that in the end, missions are very much focused on impact and not at all on excellence. But also, of course, excellence is not the main criteria in Pillar 2 in general. For European R&I stakeholders, as I said, this is the first time a strategic planning process is happening, and that R&I stakeholders actually have the possibility to shape the implementation. My personal opinion was just that some of them are a little overwhelmed just because the process is also happening really, really fast. At the end, it also came down to a discussion on the essence of science policy. So back to the discussion on top-down, bottom-up. So should there be research areas defined or not? And what I like to mention at the end, there's a paradoxical relationship between the SDG framework and research and innovation, because the SDG framework really has to be addressed in its totality, and it really demands this holistic approach. But of course, in order to make R&I useful for this SDG framework, there have to be set certain priorities. So this is what's happening with the strategic plan, which means, of course, certain SDGs have to be prioritized. But in a way, this could be seen as well, an action that actually is against this holistic approach. But then again, and this also, of course, concerns the measurement of the SDGs, because to measure progress, you also have to take the SDGs, you have to look at them in isolation to make a methodological, well, to make an assessment that is useful. But of course, then this holistic approach gets lost somehow. So this is just a, well, yeah, also a personal conclusion at the end. So yes, thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions regarding this presentation, feel free to contact infodesk@swisscore.org. I will leave Swisscore at the end of July because my traineeship ends, but I also put here my personal email address, and of course, if it's something that addresses me personally or that I could be of help, you're more than welcome to contact me. Also, so this presentation summarized the main results of this written report I was working on in the past 6 months, and this written report will also be available to the Euroresearch network. So yes, thank you very much for your attention.